You all to this week 11 e-mentoring session for cs111. In this week's session, we are actually going to cover a bit from last week's activities and notes that include on scope, right? So last week we covered mostly on scope. So I am going to focus again on those topics. And this week we are also going to have a look at arrays. That is a new topic, right? So if you see here the presentation that I have uploaded here, it is for last week. It's basically on variable scope. So let us start with our session, right? So my first question, or the first topic that we are going to discuss is on variable scope. What could you say about variable scope? Or what would you mean? I am actually not sure, Abhishek, if this week's session, these topics will be covered in this exam. But still we will be covering this topic. So, scope. When we are talking about scope, we are actually talking about boundaries. So, scope, if we look at scope, it would mean boundaries. So, if we are talking in terms of variable scope, it would mean the limitations for the variable, right? So, if you look at the notes, it says two different scopes to care about. Local scope, relevant within one function, and global scope, scope defined by the entire file. Right. So, when we are talking about variable scope, we are talking about the boundaries within which a particular data is actually valid. Right. So, if you are, let's say, storing a integer variable, right? If you are having an integer variable, so for that integer variable, the boundary or the scope would be a integer number and nothing else. Not a decimal number, not a word, not a what do you call this, character. It would be a integer. So that would be the boundary for a variable of data type int. Just like that, in a very similar way, these kinds of scope are actually what do you call categorized into not actually categorized, there exist two types of scope. Now, if you have in the previous weeks we have also covered what is called functions, right? So we have also covered functions in the previous sessions, and for a function, the boundary of a function is defined by the braces, right? So if for example, if I have to show you, right, so let's say I create a function of, let's say, int area, and then we have the boundary, what do you call this, parameter there, right? And this is the closing and the starting and the closing braces for the function, right? So within that I will create a, let's say, a variable, let's say int number, right? So if we are when we are talking about local scope, right, it is referring to a particular number that is valid within a particular function, right? For example, this variable number, int number, is only valid within this function, int area. If you let's say if you, right, so it is valid within that function. So if you are trying to use this variable outside this function, the compiler will flag a syntax error, right? So the compiler is going to flag a syntax error because this variable is only defined or only valid within this particular boundary, and that boundaries would be, I would say, and these boundaries are actually identified using these braces. Right? We have these braces. These actually specify the boundary for that, and the boundary for that would then be till here. Right? So within that area, the integer variable number is actually valid. Able to get what I am saying, guys? Okay, nice. So moving on, that is actually, so as I was saying, local scope refers to, is mostly actually referring to functions, right? So in functions, we have these variables, right? Just like this example that I have actually quoted here on top, int area, and then we have braces, opening and closing braces, and within that we have declared a integer of int variable num, right? So when we are relating this local scope, we could say that this int number is only known or valid within that particular function or within those two braces, right? If we try to use that number or variable outside the function, then the compiler, C++ compiler is going to flag a syntax error because that integer or that variable is only defined within the function. So it would not be possible to use outside the function. So you are able to understand now what I am saying? Nice. So that is actually what is variable scope. Now, if you would notice that your int main is also a what do you call this, a function, right? And most of our coding that we do is actually within that int main, right? So most of our coding that we do is within that int main. What actually happens when we try to use something that is outside the int main? And let's say if we want to use a variable that is defined within an int main, and we place that variable outside the int main, what would actually happen? The compiler is again going to flag an error because, as I said before, your int main is also a function, right? That is used within the C++ program. So just like any other function, anything that is defined within the boundary or within a function cannot be used outside, or it cannot be used in any other function, right? Just like, let's say, we have let's say int area, and then I have, right, and within that I am declaring int number, right? And then later on I create another function, let's say int func there, and then here I would say, let's say, I would say is equals to 10. So, do you think that this is actually valid? Do you think this is actually valid? Well, if you look at the, yeah, thank you, Francis. So again, in these two functions, the question of local scope comes in. If you see, the variable number is actually defined within the function area, right? Within that function, we have int number, right? So it would not be actually possible to use that variable outside that function, right? Thus, that variable will, or the compiler will flag a syntax error at the line where we are saying number is equals to 0. So it will be syntax error there, right? So that is where the error is going to pop up, right? So that was actually talking about local scope, right? So that is scope within a function. When we are talking about global scope, this refers to, or let's say global scope refers to or is defined by the entire file. This would actually mean that this is very much the opposite of local scope. In local scope, we are only limited to declare a variable within a function, right? But when it comes to global variables or global scope, it is actually possible to declare variables outside a function or the int main, right? So if I have to say that I create if I create a function here, int area again, and then I would say let's say, and then I would say int main and then I would say num. So I will create a variable outside this function. I would say int num is equals to 0, right? And then in this function, let's say I write num is equals to 25, right? And in the int main, let me just rewrite it, num is equals to 15. Now, if we are applying, so this example pretty much portrays how global scope actually works. Now, if you see this variable that we have created, right? This variable that we have created, I would say this one, int num, right? It is actually declared outside this function, outside of this function, and outside of this int main. It is declared there. So now, since it is declared outside, right, it can be used anywhere in the file. It can be actually used anywhere in the file. So for that reason, this line, right, this line and this line would actually be valid. Are you able to understand what I am saying? Yeah. So it's like this. It's like this. Where since like what is the reason why we are let's say in functions we have local scope is because variables are declared within that function. That is why when you come out of that function, whatever is inside that function is actually lost. Right? Whatever is inside the function will be lost or will be discarded. Right? That is why variables that are declared within a function is only valid there. But when it comes to global scope, in global scope, it is referring to variables that are actually declared outside the int main or outside any function. Right? There is nothing that is actually, now what do you call this, bounding that variable or stopping that variable from being used anywhere. Right? Since it is declared outside the function. So in that case, that you will not be actually required to declare that variable again, since it's a global variable. So and it's already declared, so you can use that variable again and again at any place in any function. Right? So that is what actually means. So because this variable is actually declared outside the int main, right, we are not declaring this variable again within this function, because again this is outside the int main or outside the function int area. And just like that, this variable is again declared outside the function, so it becomes a global scope, and for that reason we are not equating or declaring the variable in the int main. Able to understand what I'm saying, guys? I hope it was actually clear. So that was actually roughly what local and global scope is all about, right? So let us move on to the next slide. So if you look at this example of local scope, right, if you have a look at this example of local scope that we have, right? So we have the int main here, right? And we have the int main here, right? So and okay, so we have three boxes here, right? So we have three boxes here, and first box is for the int main, right? The second box is for the if structure, and the third box is actually for the block, or what do you call this, for loop, right? So these blocks are actually identifying the scope. Right, these boxes are actually identifying the scope that is within that what do you call this, within that int main. Right. So let's say if I wanted to use this int number, right, this int number in another function that is outside the int main, do you think it would be possible? If I wanted to use this variable number outside the int main, would that be actually possible? No, it would not be actually possible. Reason being, reason would be local scope. Since this is the int main and we have this, what do you call this, braces here and braces here, right? That is actually specifying the boundary for that int main, and our variable is actually created within that boundary. So to use that variable outside will flag a syntax error. So that variable number can only be used within that, right? So that is what block 1 is actually all about. Block 1 is actually specifying the boundary for the int main, right? So these variables such as number will not be able or will not be valid outside the int main, right? So that was for block 1, right? Let us look at block 2, right? If you look at block 2, again, first we can identify the boundary here, this here, and this one here. So straight away we could actually say that this is actually a boundary, and so any variable that is created, and listen to me very carefully, any variable that is actually created or declared, you can say declared within that boundary, is only valid there. It cannot be used outside that boundary, right? So if we look at block 2, right, if you look at our block 2, right, if you look at our block 2, the variable that is actually declared there is int k. So for that variable k, int k, the local scope concept will apply. So this variable k will only be valid within this if statement. Yes? Are you guys able to understand what I am saying? Sanjini and Francis? Nice. So that was okay. So as I was actually saying, Francis, that when we are trying to identify if something is bounded by our local scope, first you try to find out the braces that actually identify. So one braces is here and one braces is here, right? So within those places, if we are actually creating, or let's say declaring, if we are declaring any variable within those boundaries, right, it would then mean that those variables can only be used there within that boundary. It would not be possible to take those variables outside those boundaries. You will understand what I'm saying, Francis? Just like that, if you look at this example, right, if you look at this this block 2, right, if you look at this block 2, this variable int k is actually created within this boundary, right? So in that case, we will not be able to use that outside that if statement. It will flag a syntax error, right? Now let us look at our for loop, block 3, right? So if we look at block 3, right, if we look at block 3, we'll see, excuse me, if you look at block 3, then these variables, number, right, variables here is actually declared in the int main. So it is actually fine to use the variable number within this for loop, reason being that variable is still within that boundary of the int main. So this variable number is still being used within here and here. And it is still within block 1. So it is valid there. Right. Now, if you look at this, what do you call this? So if we look at this for loop, in this block 3, what is actually declared there? The declaration here is this int I. Right? In this the declaration is the int I, right? So it would actually mean, right, that your variable I that you have created is only valid within this for loop, right? Is only valid within this for loop. Now you must be actually thinking that this int I is actually created outside, or actually initialized outside these two boundaries, right? This boundary and this boundary. It is not within that boundary. So why, you must be thinking, why am I actually saying that this int I is also what do you call this, is part of that local scope, is only valid within that local scope. Now you have to keep in mind that this int I is actually created for this for loop. It's only specifically created for this for loop, right? And it is actually used within the condition of the for loop that we have. The condition of the for loop is here, right? This is the condition, right? And that condition is actually applicable for loop only, right? Right, so that is why that int I is actually part of the boundary there. Right. So now, so that is all for that slide. Let's move on to the next slide. Right. So let us have look at these nodes. That's how do you call this, nodes on scope, right? So it reads like, when you declare a variable that name and value, when you declare a variable, the name and the value is only alive for some parts of the program, right? When you're saying alive, we are meaning that that particular variable is only or can only be used within some parts of the program, right? We must declare variables before we use them, right? So it is very important that you declare variables, right? Otherwise you will get syntax error, right? So the scope of the variable starts when it is declared, right? So the place where you actually declare your variable, that is the place, or that is the area within which that within which the scope applies, right? If the variable is declared within a block, right? By block it means a compound statement. A compound statement would mean so a block is like referring to these braces, starting and ending braces. So wherever you notice that you have braces, starting and ending braces, that would actually mean that it's a block, right? So if that is the case, then it is if a variable is created within that opening and closing braces, or a block, or a compound statement, right, then that particular variable is only valid within that boundary, just like I was actually explaining to you in the previous slide. So first you have to identify the braces where they start and where they end, and then you have to check which variables are actually declared within that boundary, right? So that is what this particular statement is actually summing that up, right? So if the block is the one surrounding the entire function body, the variable is alive from where it is declared until the end of the function, right? So in the previous two slides that I was explaining, I was actually referring to the functions that I was actually using, right? So for any function, the boundary is actually specified this opening and closing statement, right? So if any variable is actually declared within that variable, if any variable is declared within a function, right, or within those boundaries, the function, or not the function, the variable will only be valid from the moment it is declared till the end of that the closing brackets. Right? Example, I could say that I have this int area, and then I have the right, and within that I have this num, right? So this particular variable would be valid when we use is valid from the moment it is declared, is valid from this point till so it is only valid from the moment it is declared to the end of the line, right? So if the block is the ones, or if the block is the one surrounding the entire function body, the variable is alive from where it is declared until the end of the function, right? So that is what actually means. So if the block defines a loop body or if body, the variable only lives till the end of the loop. So again, if a variable is actually again declared within a loop or an if and else statement, right? The first thing that you should be looking for is the opening and closing braces, right? So if a variable is declared within those braces, then it is only valid within that area, within those braces, right? You can add a block anywhere you want in the code, and it will define the scope for any variable declared within that, right? So a block is actually declared or actually identified using the opening and closing statement, opening and closing braces. So as long as those two are there, right, you have a block within which you can declare a variable, right? So that was some of the theoretical part of scope. Right, so there is another type of scope which is called global scope. This is for variables shared within or between functions, right? Global variables are declared outside any block. So it does not actually matter if you have an open or closing braces. You can actually declare variables outside those blocks, and then those variables will be referred to as global variables, right? They are visible to every function defined after them, right? So if you are creating a function, right? So if you are creating a function, let's say if I'm creating a function here, right? So I would say int area. I will be looking at this example that I used previously. Num is equals to 20 and 20, okay, and then I have this int main, and then within that int main I am actually declaring, not declaring, but using the variable num is equals to 10, right? And then when I'm talking about global variables, I'm actually referring to this, declaring variables outside the function or outside any equals to 0. So if you see, I have created a variable, let's say globally declared. So this particular variable is globally declared, right? And then it will be accessible, by any variable, or what do you call this, any function or loop, right? So just like that, if you have created a global variable outside the functions, right? So it would be valid for this function, right? It would be valid for that function, and just like that, it would also be possible to use it within that. So again, valid for this function, right? So it's that. So when it's globally declared, then it does not actually matter if you actually you can use those globally declared variables anywhere within the page, right? So that is how globally declared variables actually work, right?
You are currently the only person in this conference.
So that was actually what I was saying. So now let us move on to the next slide. So consider the function. We have this function, right? And within that function we have a parameter double temp. If temp is greater than 30, then return true, else return false. Right? So we have this example, right? And we have a question here, right? So it says, which statement would be correct? The function should not, or the function should have a return type double. Do you think the first choice is correct? No, I don't think the first choice is correct. So let's look at the second choice. The parameter temp should have been of type bool. So do you think that is a valid answer there? The parameter temp should have been of type bool. So if it was of type bool, so this should have been what? So the value that would be stored in temp, if it is a bool function, bool variable, it would be true or false. So this is what would have been stored in a temp if the temp variable had a data type of bool. But if you see in the example, the temp variable has the value 30 and its data type is double, right? So let's look at the next choice. The function does not always return a value. Right, so if you look at the function, then we have an if and else structure. So in the if structure, we have a return data type, right? We have a return data type here. We have a return data type here. And then in the else statement, we have a return as well. So it would not be actually, that statement will now be false, because in any scenario, in any way, the program, or what do you call this, the function will provide a return, right? In the if statement it will provide a return, and then in the else statement it will again provide the return, right? So let us look at the next answer. You can only use one return in a function, right? So you can only return one, or you can only use one return in a function. Right, so you can only use one return in the function, right? So right, So yes, it is actually possible to use. Now when it comes to return, right, when it comes to return, when the name return is called within the line or within a function, then the compiler would actually move out of the function, right? So that is there. So when a return word is used in the function, right, then the compiler will automatically move out of will exit the function. So that is why we have written there, right? So you can only use one return in a function. So if you look at our code here, we have two returns that are used here, right? We have two returns that are used here, right? But these two return functions do not conflict or do not interrupt one another, right? At one time, only one return will be called, or one thing will be returned, right? So if let's say your value is greater than 30, if your temp value is greater than 30, then obviously you will enter the if statement and that will return true there, right? And it is going to discard your else statement, so return false will be discarded from there. Just like that, if your temp value is less than 30, then you will not enter the if statement, but you will enter the else statement. In that case, you will return false instead of true, and then the true will be because the if statement true will not be returned; it will be discarded. Right? So let us look at this one more question, right, before we will end our session here, right? The question reads as such: consider the following function: void display pay, right? So this is a function, right? And within that function, you have these parameters: double gross pay and double tax rate. Right? Those are the parameters for that function, right? And then within that function, you have cout your gross pay and then gross pay, and then cout net pay, and that is gross pay minus gross pay times tax. So what would be the good comment to describe this function, right? So what do you think that what would be the answer there? Francis and Sanjini? Right, so if you look at the function there, what is the data type for the function? It's a void function. So if you look at choice A, the comment that is written there is this is a void function. So that could be a comment for that function, but is it a good comment or not? We don't know yet. So let us look at the other function, other comments. This function prints gross and net pay given doubles gross pay and tax rate. So I think it's a really long comment there. So I think it will be, we'll move on to the next one. This function uses parameters gross pay and tax rate and returns nothing. Not exactly. This function is named display pay. Nope, I don't think so. This function prints the standard output to screen. No. So our contradiction would be, or our best answers we can have to choose from is between A and B. A and B. So one of these two choices would describe best our solution, right? So Is it a void statement? Yes, it is a void statement, right? So this function prints gross and net pay and tax rate. So does our function print a so the function prints gross pay and net pay given doubles gross pay and tax rate. So whether the answer is A or B, I would leave it to you guys to decide, because yes, so if I were to give an answer, I would actually say that B is a perfect or would be a better comment for that, because it's pretty much describing all the variables that are used within that function and what that particular function, yeah, and what that particular function is returning. It is actually returning nothing, so it is actually stated in that comment. So our answer would then be from this one, right? So we have B, right? So that is pretty much it for this week's session. Thank you all for coming, and before you guys leave, I would actually need your attendance if that's possible. Student ID. Okay. So you want me to explain the example on block 3, right? Okay. The main thing that you have to understand here is that with some numbers. Okay, okay. To help you understand. Okay. So when we are referring to this block 3, right? If you are referring to this block 3, this is so what is actually defining the local scope there? These braces here, right? These braces and these braces, right? So these two braces actually define the what do you call this local scope for that particular loop. Now, if you are looking at this int I is equals to 0, right? Since that int I is actually declared within the condition of the for loop, right? Since it is situated here, right, within this condition, and you have to actually note this. You will have to actually note this one thing, that this int I is specifically created for this particular function, right? That is why I am actually telling you, that is why that int I becomes becomes bounded to that local scope, because it is only used for that for loop, right? So if I actually wanted to use that I outside that for loop, it would not be actually possible, because that I is actually declared within that for loop. Are you able to understand what I'm saying, Sanjay? Yes. Okay, so we'll end our session here. Thank you all for attending. In next week's session, we will continue on variable scope, and I will focus more on arrays. Right, so till then, if you have any